In April 1934, a group of young caving enthusiasts were tackling the difficult descent of Swilden's Hole, a cave where a stream plunges deep underground beneath the Mendip Hills in Somerset. The story of the exploration and descent of this cave was already a caving classic, but what unseen wonders might exist beyond the known limits of the cave was something that gripped the imagination of many that came here. Graham Balcom, the leader of this group, and his close friend and caving partner Jack Shepherd had hatched a plan. In retrospect, it was a plan based more on sheer daring and determination than it was on science. At the very bottom of the cave, a deep pool of water, what cavers call a sump, stopped any progress. The only way on, it seemed, lay below water level. To pass the obstacle, Balcom had constructed a makeshift type of breathing apparatus. How deep they might have to dive and how far was anybody's guess. The equipment was little more than a section of old bicycle frame to which was attached a mouthpiece, simple inlet and outlet valves, and a 40-foot length of garden hose. In those days, long before any form of self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, this team had little prior knowledge on which to base their experimentation. Nevertheless, the events that were to follow would be the start of an epic journey of discovery. Once underwater, stirred up mud would reduce the visibility to zero in a matter of seconds, and even at only a foot or two depth, Balcom found the pressure made breathing quite impossible with such basic equipment. The water was icy cold. Frozen stiff and shaking uncontrollably, Balcom was beaten, at least for the time being.
They started the diving in Swilden's Hole with the rather crude apparatus that I manufactured from an old bicycle. Didn't expect to get any real results when looked at in retrospect. I was just optimistic and believed what other people said that one could do without a pump to supply air under pressure. The result was, of course, a failure because the depth, although only about a foot, coupled with the intimidation of the place at the time, drove me out rather quicker than it should have done. Jack Shepherd followed and had a try, and he likewise was not able to get through. We both came to the same conclusion, that namely that apparatus was quite unsuitable. So what we had to do was get something which was pressure-fed or self-contained. The two courses were open to us.
That June, they tried a different approach. Unfortunately, the sump pool was located directly below the village church in Priddy, and it was Sunday. The explosive charge took the roof back a foot or so, but it revealed nothing. Finally, in 1936, they were able to return with a new and more elaborate breathing apparatus. A stirrup pump was brought in to supply air under pressure, and there was a telephone link to the diver, who was encased in an elaborate hooded smock that they had constructed from rubberized canvas. Some waist-length fishing waders completed the outfit. This time, Jack Shepherd was to make the first attempt.
Keep pumping. Any sound yet, Jumbo? How's it going? Can't hear.
Although the hood added to the sense of claustrophobia, the diver had, at least, a degree of protection from the cold water. The breathing worked better, but the pump could not deliver the air fast enough.
All right. Okay, say again. Keep pumping.
Fortunately, after about 10 feet, the roof lifted.
Go for it,
Shepherd was able to stand up. The sump had been passed.
Keep pumping! Keep pumping! You alright? Yeah. Yes, fantastic. Yes, great.
The passing of the sump absolutely electrified the whole district. We were a keen lot of cavers down there and very proud of our prowess in this and that and the other aspect of it, and we were in competition between one club and another as usual, and we had fought our way through, and the place just went up like a bonfire. It was magnificent.
2 weeks later, Walkham and Shepherd were both able to pass the sump and to explore together about 1,000 feet of passages beyond it. At the end, a second pull, a second sump, and a new challenge. To continue would mean radical rethinking. A hose was no longer practical. An oxygen cylinder would now feed pure oxygen directly into the hood. The diver was to be Balcom. He would have to open the bottle valve to supply oxygen each time he breathed in, and then to close it as he exhaled through a valve in the hood. Visibility was again virtually zero. To make things worse, this sump was more convoluted and more constricted than the first. He passed a frightening underwater squeeze. Nevertheless, he eventually reached an air surface and found himself in a new chamber, some 20 feet long and 20 feet high. To his relief, the lifeline that he trailed had run out. Anxiously, he returned. Somehow this time, he seemed to find an easier route. And as it happened, it was as well. For as he surfaced, his cylinder gave its last gasp of oxygen. One thing had become obvious. To continue with such primitive homemade equipment would be tempting fate. They needed help from the professionals.
But C.B. Gorman, when we made an approach to them, just did not understand. We couldn't get them to understand the difficulty of the approach down to the sump. But they, nevertheless, offered us anything which they had in their showroom we could borrow. And what they had in their showroom were copper hard hats and pumps. And, well, do you think I was going to turn down such a good offer as that? No, I found a cave which was big enough to take the equipment. Swildon's Hole could wait.
The operation duly was moved to Wookey Hole, a commercially operated tourist cave at the foot of the Mendip Hills and not far from the cathedral city of Wells. In this cave, pathways constructed for the paying public made it possible to bring the large pumping machines and other heavy equipment to their newly chosen diving site in Chamber 3, some 500 feet from the entrance. The owner of the cave, conscious of the publicity and at the same time hoping for big new discoveries, had been happy to grant them the access they required. Already, several months had been spent training in preparation for this first series of underground dives.
C.B. Gorman, who lent us diving equipment, insisted that we should be trained, and they sent one of their expert trainers down to teach us how to dive. We did our initial diving in the Minories Pond on the top of Mendip. And we played around among the tadpoles for many a weekend there until our tutor said we were fit to dive. And off we went to Wookey Hole, started to dive in the third chamber.
Two divers were now undertaking the long final preparation before they might enter the sump. Walkham, as leader of the expedition, was to be the first to dive, while Penelope Powell, the only female in the six-diver team, had been chosen to accompany him. The enormous pump, which would supply them with air, brought the earlier attempts in Swildens with a football inflator into stark perspective. Now peering through the portholes of their copper helmets, with heavy lead boots to keep them firmly on the bottom, and trailing thick, unwieldy airlines, these first dives were to be a completely new and somewhat unreal experience.
Sensation on first going underwater was of such a strange world. Above, the whole cave is brown, and it's humming with the noise of people. You get your head underwater, and all of a sudden, the water is green, and the bottom is a beautiful yellowish sand, and the rocks are brown. The way on looked very, very dark and intimidating.
Chambers 4 and 5 were passed reasonably quickly, but to reach 6 they had to descend steeply until they were at a depth of 16 feet. Eventually 170 feet from base, Chamber 7 was entered, with a silvery air surface well out of reach, high above them.
We thought it looked very, very promising, and we had to find a means of getting up to the surface. We were quite heavily weighted. We had some 30 pounds lead front and rear, 11 pounds lead on each of our boots, keeping us on the bottom. So we arranged a float on the end of a rope, 5-gallon oil drums actually. Sent that up to the surface, filled with air by opening the driver's sleeve and letting air escape into it. We were able then to climb up the rope after these floating tin cans and get our heads out of water at the top and look around. The actual sight we saw thrilled us enormously. After the work at Wookie, we sat back a while to think what next to do, and obviously a self-contained equipment was necessary, but I hadn't got the time and facilities then to make one. And then the war came and interrupted practical efforts while in London. I was moved up to Harrogate, and I was able to spend some time. I took my workshop with me and put it up in the loft up there, and I got busy.
The Yorkshire Dales, riddled with caves and a couple of prime diving sites, lay some 50 miles from Harrogate. Borkham bought himself a tandem, and with his wife behind him, he made the long ride to the quiet valley of Kingsdale. His newly made diving equipment was towed behind the bicycle on a custom-built trailer. Close to the road, hidden behind a wall, a large stream emerges from a flooded cavern known as Keld Head. Here, Borkham would test his newly made oxygen set for the first time.
The set was based on what bit of information was available from C.B. Gorman's books and from the breathing apparatus people at the local hospital. And I decided on a 2-cylinder oxygen supply, a soda lime a canister for taking out the carbon dioxide, and the whole thing mounted by straps on the back and front of the diver.
Borkham had given the name Aflo to the second piece of equipment that he would carry in his hand. It stood for apparatus for laying out line and underwater navigation. A line laid from a reel on the Aflo would secure his safe return. The basis of what Borkham would pioneer here on this day would establish cave diving technique for many years to come. Two 48-volt car headlamps powered from an alkaline battery, lit his way as he progressed step by step into the unknown passage. The Aflo also carried a depth gauge and compass. His life now depended absolutely on his homemade breathing apparatus and on his own skill and judgment. Weighted down, stumbling along the rocky floor, managing the rather clumsy Aflo, Balcom's progress was slow. If there should be an emergency, any return would be equally slow. Nevertheless, between March and October of 1945, Balcom penetrated 180 feet into the flooded cave without finding air. Once deep into the cave, he faced a real emergency. His oxygen supply cut off. For a few heart-stopping moments, he fumbled with his equipment. Then he found, to his enormous relief, that a vital valve had been turned off when it came into contact with the cave wall. Slowly, he recovered his composure as the precious oxygen supply returned. Balcom was able to make the safe return to daylight and to safety. Lessons had been learned, but in a flooded cave, you may only too easily pay for those lessons with your life. The war had given diving a new impetus and introduced a new word to the general public. The frogmen used oxygen rebreathing equipment not too dissimilar to that Balcom had developed, but better designed and mass-produced. At the war's end, Balcom saw a golden opportunity.
The handicap of equipment we overcame by contacting the Admiralty, who had quite a lot of surplus equipment that they were quite happy to get rid of. They stored it at C.B. Gorman's. That's how I happened to come across it. Told them the story, and they were sympathetic, and they gave me a chip to go and collect a tremendous amount of equipment. Well, I wasn't quite content with that. I took a furniture van down there and loaded it up because the attendants at the store were anxious to have it closed down, and the more they got rid of, the better.
A second development made this even more fortuitous. Balcom had formed a new group of enthusiasts known as the Cave Diving Group, and the centre of operations had returned to the Mendip Hills. The naval diving equipment had been checked and modified for cave diving, and now there was a new golden opportunity for them to further unlock the secrets of Wookey Hole. The basic principles of the Aflo had been developed into a smaller, easier piece of equipment, and there was enough equipment for each diver to maintain and modify his own personal kit to suit his own preference. Although the means of progress was still bottom walking, movement was infinitely easier than it had been with the old traditional hard hat equipment. The diver was now self-contained and largely self-reliant, but that in itself produced new hazards. The map of Wookey Hole was slowly but surely changing. In 1948, a huge chamber, the biggest in the cave so far, had been entered. Here an advanced diving base could be established. The way on was seen to be a submerged passage which descended steeply. In April 1949, the cave diving group planned a major operation. Some divers were experimenting with the use of fins. Balcom was unsure about their safety.
Fins were only just coming in. I was one who opposed fins. I found that I could not achieve a satisfactory use of fins in cave conditions. The ups and the downs of caves. I couldn't manage it. I don't know how the experts do it nowadays, but I failed.
Coase and Davis, two of the most experienced divers, had been supported as far as Chamber 9 by less experienced divers, including new recruit Gordon Marriott. Marriott was a highly experienced wartime frogman, a very capable open water diver, but he was new to cave diving. 3 months earlier, Chamber 11 had been reached, and exploration stopped at an underwater cliff face, which took the passage to a dangerous depth. Beyond 30 foot deep, oxygen was known to become toxic and could cause convulsions. The plan was that by using fins to swim high in the roof, Coase and Davis might avoid going deep and so find a way on at a higher level. Here, hovering between roof and floor, they found it was all too easy to become disorientated. Nevertheless, they reach a point some 200 feet past the earlier limit of exploration. Unfortunately, they've found no high-level route, and the dipping roof now threatens to force them to an unsafe depth. Davis signals to Coase that to continue would be too dangerous. It's now time to return to Chamber 9. It was 8:30 p.m.
Graham, yes, Bob here.
Having dived earlier, Beckons was now in Chamber 3, manning the telephone link through to Chamber 9. The news is disappointing. It appears that the cave diving at Wookie may have reached an insurmountable obstacle. They decide that, on the return to Chamber 3, Coase, using fins, will accompany the relatively inexperienced Lucy, who is bottom walking. Davis and Marriott will follow later, and will take a longer and less direct route back. Marriott, who played an important part in the D-Day landings, and who works as an exhibition diver for the Butlins holiday camps, is now keen to get as much experience of cave diving as he can. Marriott is in front. The visibility, however, is virtually zero. Halfway back, Davis loses touch with Marriott, but feeling a twitching on the line, he assumes that he is somewhere ahead of him. Davis finally surfaces, to be met by Coase, Lucy and Beckons. A bombshell. Marriott has not arrived. Somehow he must have lost touch with the safety line. Marriott, a diver with hundreds of hours underwater, is missing somewhere between Chamber 9 and Chamber 3. At about 9 o'clock they begin a search, using what oxygen they have left. Around 9:30, Coase finds Marriott. His body lies motionless among the rocks on the bottom. His oxygen bottle will be found to be empty. It would be a week or two later before his reserve oxygen bottle was found, and it was some distance away. It was full. It had been carried tied to his body by a short lanyard, rather than being built in, which was standard practice for the cave diving group. Quite what had occurred remains a mystery. Perhaps trying to utilise the bottle in such poor conditions, he lost it, and in trying to relocate it, became disorientated and then lost the guideline. It came as a big blow for Balcombe, at a time when the cave diving group was flourishing.
Gordon Marriott, his death was a great blow to us. It came at an unfortunate time in the affairs of the diving down at Wookey, but the actual cause of it was, I believe, and I think most of the others believe too, that Gordon Marriott, who though an absolutely expert open water diver, a man who'd in the war on the beaches, and he spent 500 hours on the water, a magnificent diver, just didn't accommodate to the cave conditions. We had tried in the group to choose our members from people not as divers, but as first of all as cavers, who then became divers. We thought it was much more important to have it that way round.
It seemed that the events of the day might well bring an end to the diving at Wookey Hole, and perhaps even to the cave diving group. Who then could have foreseen that around the corner were developments that would catapult them all into a whole new era?